This is part 10 of our progress report so far on our haul out at Reback Island, Langkawi. I own a 2013 Island Spirit catamaran, 38 feet, and Reback Island is just off Langkawi Island itself. And here's a shot of the island resort, the marina, and the shipyards in the top middle of the photograph. And here's a Google image of the shipyard. My boat is on the hard in the shipyard and we're doing work on it. And as usual, the heaviest object in the universe is the amount of money I've spent on this boat. We flew to Kuala Lumpur to renew my wife's passport, and we used a company called Malindo Air, and they were actually the cheapest of all of the flights. Because of the COVID situation, flights have become expensive. We went to the Australian Embassy and renewed Linda's passport, and while we're in KL we stayed at my wife's friend's place, a prominent batik artist called Anwar Lim, and this is some of his batik work, but he also does murals. And we went and visited a mural that he's doing in a garage for a business, a company that was willing to hire a deaf artist. And this is only half finished, but it's looking rather good. You can Google Anwar Lim. He's a prominent artist in Malaysia, and there's lots of entries in the Googles. On the third day we flew back to Langkawi, and here's an image of Reback Island shipyard and marina, and of course we used Malindo Air to fly home to our boat. We went straight back to work, and I'm putting on a base coat of epoxy, a thickened epoxy, so that I can lay some double bias woven mat over the top of it. I used metre long lengths, and because it was on a vertical angle I had to be careful not to drop it. I patted it in nice and firm, and then I rubbed it down to get rid of all the air bubbles. And when the mat is wet, it seems to shrink in the middle, so then you had to stretch it out. So when I rolled a coat of thickened epoxy over the top of the mat, I ran it vertical strokes to pull the mat up and stretch it out, and then bottom strokes to stretch out the bottom of it. My wife was mixing the thickened epoxy. After rolling on the first coat of wet thick epoxy, I then rolled out another metre of the double bias woven mat, wetted down, and slapped it on the join between the hull and the upper deck, on top of the blue Technifill filler. And then I rolled out another layer of thickened epoxy over the top of the mat. And as I said, once I rolled it out, I had to raise it, and because it shrank in the middle, and stretch it out. We repeated the same process right around the inside and outsides of the port and starboard hulls. Just to give you a bit of an idea, here's a before video of the join between the hull and the upper deck. There's 2 or 3 of these holes that are weeping water on between the first and second level of the hull, and I'm going to have to Dremel those out and probably vacuum them drier, and then fill them with epoxy resin ready for painting. Here's a long shot of the hull before we started using the Technifill to fill the gap. So here we are, after we've filled the gap between the hull and the upper deck with Technic fill, and laid some double bias woven mat over the top of that, and then put a layer of epoxy over the top of that, and it was ready for just tidying up and cleaning up. You can see the edges of the mat are a bit rough, so here's a video of my wife grinding out the little daggy bits of the edges of the double bias woven mat. We forgot to use a wet process using the hose, and that made the job a little bit harder. You can see the sanding of the edges, just to give you an idea. Just sanded off the edges, definitely not touched the matting, and sanded off the edges here. Here's the first coat of filler, and I'll sand it back and get some shape, get some curve into it, and put on another coat to get rid of those little imperfections, or create more of them depending on the way you look at it with my skill. I used water and sanded down the first layer of filler using the air sander, and that really did make the job easier. So the port transom was dry, so we started the process of laying the Divinycell. Here's a video of the before shot of the transom, and see all the damage that need to be fixed for glassing and sanding the damaged areas. So I've smoothed out the edges and smoothed that down. The rough lumpy areas will be filled with a thickened epoxy, so the edges are perfect. I've taken the railing off so that we can get the Divinycell core, sandwich core underneath it. We've cleaned up the step, and the Divinycell will probably fit in there nice and neatly. So Linda has cut the Divinycell to the shape of the transom and the step, so it's ready to be epoxied. We're going to put one thickened layer of epoxy on that, and one thickened layer of epoxy on the step, and then manipulate it to fit the shape. So that you can see that we've glued into place the Divinycell, and now I'm putting weights on and tying it down and tying it against the transom to make sure that it sticks properly without any problems. So here is the port transom with the Divinycell stuck to it, and it'll dry overnight. You can see the areas that didn't turn out that well. Once we've put in filler and another layer of double bias woven mat, it should turn out better than it looks now. I was a little bit disappointed in how daggy it is, but once it's cut and shaped to the outside edges of the transom and the step, and then built up with the filler, and then some double bias matting, the core will look much better than it currently is. Still a lot of work to do, sanding after that, then more epoxy, and then the copper coat and white paint on the steps. And here's a shot of the step itself, and it looks rather good, just it will be better when the job's finished. I've cut off the edges of the Divinycell to the shape of the sides of the transom, and it looks much neater and ready for filling. So I decided to prepare the area so that I could overlap the double bias woven mat underneath the Divinycell foam core and attach it to the hull. Using some filler, I filled in all the gaps between the Divinycell core, and it's ready for glassing and putting the mat in place. And it looks rather good so far, just needs to be sanded off. Of course you'll see that in the next video. So this video was produced by myself, and it's the end of another exciting video of my part 10 of our progress report of our haul out so far.